Warning: the following episode contains sensitive content such as child abuse, sexual abuse, and graphic descriptions of homicide. It may be sensitive to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Grace Packer endured a lifetime of abuse, yet she was never shy of a wide, bright smile. Unfortunately, the system set up to protect children such as Grace failed when they allowed her to live with her adoptive mother, Sara Packer, a woman who admitted to having inappropriate sexual relations with another foster child. For 11 months, Grace had a break from the daily verbal, physical, and sexual abuse when she lived with a relative in North Carolina. But less than a year later, Grace was summoned back to Pennsylvania to live with Sara Packer and her live-in boyfriend, Jacob Sullivan. Soon after she arrived, Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan began to plan Grace's murder, culminating in her reported missing from their home July 7th, 2016 to October 31st, 2016, where her remains were thrown on the side of the road like a useless piece of trash. In part 2 of this episode, you will find out just how evil and monstrous Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan are, and what steps have been taken, if any, to prevent a tragedy like this from happening again. You're listening to Departed in Pennsyltucky Part 2, A System Failed, the case of Grace Packer. In law enforcement's eyes, Halloween is a night when most police keep an extra eye out for suspicious activity. Halloween sometimes gives criminals extra opportunities to commit a crime because most houses are typically left open and people who are at home are distracted. Halloween parties have become more popular over the years, resulting in intoxication, which ultimately ends with people drinking and driving. On October 31st, 2016, Pennsylvania state troopers were most likely getting prepared for what is known as a busy night for law enforcement. However, state troopers were derailed when they responded to a call of a father and son who were hunting and came across human remains along Whitehaven Road in Bear Creek Township near the Francis E. Walter Reservoir. Initially, the duo thought they were animal remains, but a head and torso became visible upon further inspection. A pathologist determined that the legs had been forcibly removed from the torso, showing scarring and marks consistent with being cut with a bow saw, and the official cause of death was pending further investigation. On November 8th, 2016, the remains were positively identified as those of Grace Packer. She was identified through dental records and a medical implant device. Pathologists determined that because there was no insect infestation on the torso, Grace had been killed elsewhere, and her body stored for a while before being dumped, and that scarring and other marks on her remains showed that a saw had likely been used to cut her bones. Grace's remains were cremated, and her ashes were given to her grandparents. 2 days later, on November 11th, 2016, Sara Packer was charged with child endangerment and obstruction of the administration of law. Authorities alleged that Sara interfered with the search for Grace. They also learned Sara had been cashing and using $3,616 of Social Security disability checks intended for Grace. The $700 a month in government stipends for Grace's care were still being issued to Sara, even though Grace was missing. In addition, a letter supposedly from Grace was found in her school records. The letter was typed and addressed to her family, including an apology for being a burden and stating she was leaving. Further investigation showed that Grace could not have written that letter, given her academic and social skills. Date: December 30th, 2016. Location: Horsham, Pennsylvania. The twisted lives and relationship between Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan became more bizarre when a woman named Kathleen Albright called 911. Kathleen was involved in a polyamorous relationship with Sara Packer and Jacob Sullivan. Earlier that day, Kathleen called 911 and told the dispatcher she had found Jacob Sullivan unresponsive inside their home in Horsham, Pennsylvania. Kathleen believed Jacob had overdosed on pills. The dispatcher asked Kathleen if she knew why Jacob would do that. Kathleen answered, "I don't know if you have watched the news lately. Someone we were involved with recently. It's a big mess. It's a big mess. And I don't know how to explain it, but oh my God." Soon after, medics arrived and they found Jacob slumped on the bedroom floor with pill bottles and loose pills all around the room. He was taken to Abington Hospital, where he was in critical condition, and hospital staff began treating him for a drug overdose. Police then interviewed Kathleen and found a handwritten suicide note at home. The letter, written by Jacob, father of 4, said, "Dear babies, I love you all so much. You are the only people I have always been able to count on. I'm sorry that I am taking the coward's way out, but I don't have any strength left in me. People want to judge and lie and break me down. They have. I can't exist with Sara in jail, and those fucking lying pigs and the whore media have made it impossible for us to live. They don't care how many lives or laws they break. I know you will always know that we had nothing to do with this, no matter what lies they tell. I'm sorry to leave you. Remember all I've taught you. Be brave, stand tall, and do your best to be stronger than I was. I love you." Signed, Daddy. Later that night, Kathleen called 911 a second time. This time, she told the dispatcher after police and medics had left, she found Sara Packer unresponsive inside the home bathroom. Sara Packer had been in police custody for about a month on the child endangerment and obstruction charge. But on December 22nd, 2016, Sara's $200,000 bail was reduced to $10,000, and she was allowed to go home, even though investigators named Sara a person of interest in Grace's death. After she hung up with 911, Kathleen drove Sara to Abington Hospital. Police determined that Sara and Jacob had entered a suicide pact and tried to kill themselves by overdosing on drugs. Date: January 7th, 2017. Location: Abington Hospital. On Saturday, January 7th, 2017, Megan Carras, then 24, was shy of her 3-month mark as a nurse at Abington Hospital. She was on the overnight shift when she was assigned to Jacob Sullivan, the hulky 400-pound unrestrained patient recovering from ingesting 13 kinds of medication. As Megan offered him a nasal decongestant, Jacob asked her whether Pennsylvania had the death penalty. He was confused as to why the police were coming down so hard on Sara, since he was the one who had killed Grace. Nonetheless, Jacob was in a dark place and wanted to kill. Jacob also complained about Grace, saying at one point that he and Sara Packer wished they could return the adopted girl, but they needed the money. Alyssa Kehoe also attended Jacob's side during his stay at Abington Hospital. With her, Jacob suddenly began to talk to Alyssa about a girl named Grace. As Alyssa sat with Jacob, he continued to ramble on about Grace, telling her he killed her and he liked it, adding that Grace was the worst thing that happened to our family. Then, not seeming to make any sense, he rambled, "Look at the Quaker townhouse. Look in the attic." Afterwards, staff members at Abington Memorial Hospital then contacted investigators and told them during the overnight hours, Jacob admitted he was responsible for the murder of Grace. He also claimed that Sara was his accomplice. The hospital staff also told investigators they believed Jacob admitted he had killed Grace to his family members who were at his bedside when they visited him. When talking to police about Jacob's confession, several nurses described feeling ill and vomited after hearing Jacob's words. Date: Sunday, January 8th, 2017. Location: District Court, Newtown, Pennsylvania. "20 days after Grace's death was announced, investigators arrested Jacob Sullivan and Sara Packer for the murder and dismemberment of Grace. Jacob Sullivan was arraigned on charges of homicide, rape, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, unlawful restraint, kidnapping, possessing instruments of crime, endangering the welfare of a child, abuse of a corpse, simple assault, tampering with physical evidence, and corresponding conspiracy charges. He was held without bail, and as he was led out of the courthouse, Jacob apologized for his actions. Sara Packer's charges included homicide, kidnapping, unlawful restraint, possessing instruments of crime, endangering the welfare of a child, abuse of a corpse, simple assault, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to commit rape. When Sara Packer's public defender met with her shortly after her arrest, she introduced herself to Sara Packer and asked if she had any questions. "Is he dead?" Sara Packer asked about Jacob Sullivan, adding, "Did he make a statement?" "That wasn't the plan." While searching Sara Packer's residence, police found an October 16th, 2016 receipt hidden in a picture frame. It was from a Tractor Supply store for the purchase of a bow saw and 2 extra blades. However, when searching the home, investigators found no bow saw nor no saw blades. When they checked the video surveillance from the Tractor Supply store, it showed Sara Packer making the purchase. A few days after his arrest, Jacob Sullivan sat down with investigators and gave a taped interview that was 97 minutes long. In the interview, Jacob Sullivan began to tell investigators everything about Grace's murder. Jacob's chilling, matter-of-fact confession to detectives was outright disturbing. He even called detectives back into the room at least 3 times to add details, laughing as he described Grace looking to Sara for help during the assault. Jacob admitted he and Sara had been plotting Grace's rape and murder for over a year, soon after Grace returned from living with her cousin in North Carolina. Saying he wanted the torture and death to be fun for Grace, the duo prepared for Grace's July 7th, 2016 murder by preparing the attic with a mattress, a lamp, and other items. On the morning of July 7th, 2016, Jacob took Viagra. Then he and Sara drove Grace, still sleepy and in her pajamas, from the couple's Tennis Avenue home in Abington, Pennsylvania, to another house they rented in the 900 block of Cherry Road in Quakertown. Once there, he began to punch Grace in the face, splitting her lip. The beating left Grace crying and with a bloody wound on her head. Jacob added, "It was not meant to be mean. It was mean," adding, "It was a weird fantasy kind of thing." Jacob believed the 14-year-old Grace was very sexual, so the couple discussed raping Grace before killing her. The couple took Grace to the 3rd floor of the residence, where Jacob raped Grace while Sara watched. Jacob said as he sexually assaulted Grace, he could tell Sara was sexually aroused. Afterwards, Sara Packer left to buy Tylenol PM and other drugs to sedate Grace. When Sara returned, the couple gave Grace the pills, telling her the drugs would help minimize her pain from the assaults. Then they tied her up and gagged her with a ball gag from a sex shop to silence Grace during the attack. When Sara returned, the couple gave Grace the pills, telling her the drugs would help minimize her pain from the assaults, tied her up, and gagged her with a ball gag from a sex shop to silence Grace. Then, they left her to die in the cedar closet of the sweltering attic, hoping the heat would kill Grace. But after returning at 3 p.m. the following day, they found Grace was still alive, and it was then Jacob put his arm around her neck and slowly squeezed the life out of her. To mask the smell of Grace's corpse, Sara and Jacob covered Grace's body in cat litter and mothballs. And even with Grace's body in the attic, the couple still made daily trips to the attic, where they kept their clothes. When investigators visited Sara's house in October 2016 to follow up on Grace's whereabouts, the pair worried her body would be found. After they left, Sara came up with the idea to bring Grace's remains down to a 2nd-floor bathroom and dismember her in the tub using a saw Sara had purchased. Jacob described dismembering Grace's remains, saying it was like wrestling with a 20-pound turkey. Afterwards, Sara and Jacob drove to upstate Pennsylvania via back roads, intentionally avoiding the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and dispose of Grace's remains near the Francis Walter Dam in Luzerne County. As they were dumping Grace's body, Jacob thought to himself, "This isn't going to end up well." After confessing and being led back to jail, Jacob asked prosecutors for protection in prison over fears he'd be assaulted or killed for the crimes he committed against Grace. His request was granted, having been kept out of the general population. Date: January 16th, 2017. Location: New Life Presbyterian Church, Glenside, Pennsylvania. Over 200 people gathered for Grace's memorial on that cold, overcast day in mid-January. The service was arranged by several mothers of children who went to school with Grace at Abington Junior High. Each mother participated in the service by lighting candles and reading poems and scriptures. There were also complete strangers offering support for Grace, the girl with a smile for days, who could be anyone's daughter, sister, granddaughter, or neighbor. Photos of the happy teen were shown throughout the service, and it showed her happily opening birthday gifts, smiling with her siblings, and enjoying rides at an amusement park. A letter was read from Carrie Heisinger, the cousin who took Grace in. It described a young girl who loved shopping, getting manicures, ordering pizza, and watching Twilight movies. "I miss your girly giggles," Carrie wrote. "I miss our talks. Most of all, I miss you, Grace. I cannot understand why your life was brutally taken in a way no one should have ever endured. The only good in a way of this is that you are free of pain, hate, abuse, and any evil in this world." Jackie Horst, one of the 5 Abington mothers who organized the memorial service for Grace, said she appreciated how friendly Grace was to her autistic son Bobby, who rode the school bus with Grace and shared a lunch table with her. The socially awkward Bobby talked about Grace all the time, so for Bobby to hit it off with Grace was a huge deal. As a result, one of the organizers of the memorial service formed a foundation in Grace's honor called On Gracie's Wings. The foundation aimed to assist foster children in the transition into independent living. The case was prosecuted by Bucks County District Attorney Matt Weintraub. Weintraub had only been the district attorney of Bucks County for a few months before being thrust into the tragic and ghastly case that captured the attention of media around the country. The murder of 4 friends on a local farm, all committed by Cosmo DiNardo and his cousin Sean Kratz. If there was anyone who could bring Grace's killer to justice, it was Matt Weintraub. During the pre-trial phase, requests to show close-up photos of Grace's dismembered body on a blue tarp to a jury were denied by the presiding judge, calling the images emotionally disturbing. Attorney Matt Weintraub told the judge he wanted to use the photos and pictures of Grace's head and torso lying in the woods to show what Cody Blakesy and his father saw when they stumbled upon her remains on Halloween 2016. Saying Grace was intentionally desecrated, he felt the photos were an essential part of his argument that Jacob and Sara were guilty of mistreating Grace's body. However, the judge doubled down on her decision, saying she believed jurors would be too upset by the images. Date: February 23rd, 2019. Location: Newtown Courthouse, Bucks County. Right before the jury selection for Jacob Sullivan's trial, he pled guilty. But before it could be finalized, he was rushed to the hospital with high blood pressure. A few days later, when Jacob again pled guilty to the murder and dismemberment of Grace, his guilty plea was just a few steps shy of formalities when his blood pressure skyrocketed again after he complained of a headache, and he was again taken to the hospital. After his guilty plea was finalized, a jury was picked to decide whether Jacob Sullivan would spend life in prison or be sentenced to death. In exchange for a life sentence and testifying against Jacob Sullivan, Sara Packer agreed to plead guilty. The prosecution agreed to a life sentence for Sara in exchange for her confession because the physical evidence against her was weak, and it was Jacob who raped and killed Grace, and her crimes did not qualify for the death penalty. Date: March 20th, 2019. Location: Newtown Courthouse, Bucks County. Speaking for the first time publicly about the murder of Grace, Sara Packer, wearing her issued red prison jumpsuit, described watching Jacob Sullivan rape and kill Grace on July 7th, 2016. When Sara and Jacob first met in 2013, Jacob was Grace's biggest advocate, but over time, Sara educated Jacob, showing him how hard Grace was to discipline. After Jacob moved in with Sara, she began grooming him to assault Grace in the same way she had groomed her ex-husband, David Packer, to assault a child she had fostered. And although Grace had been described as a bright, bubbly girl with an infectious laugh, Sara saw her as a difficult child who often acted out and needed to be punished. Grace had become unimportant to her in her eyes, and Sara had wanted her to go away. She wanted her dead. She admitted she hated Grace and shared a rape-murder fantasy with Jacob Sullivan. By July 2016, Sara said she had given up on Grace. For weeks, Sara had secretly put medication in Grace's pudding to make her compliant, make her groggy. She did so one last time on July 7th, 2016, before she and Jacob took Grace from a home they rented in Abington to another rental property near Quakertown. She admitted to participating in the kidnapping, rape, killing, dismemberment, and disposal of Grace, a child she thought of as a non-entity. She said she and Jacob didn't initially plan to kill Grace, rather keep her in the attic for Jacob to rape whenever he wanted to. But Sara had thought Jacob panicked. I think the reality of what he had done set in, and there was no going back, she said. So he decided it was time for her to die. She stated that Jacob was the ringleader in Grace's killing, and that she didn't want Grace to die, adding that she got wrapped up in Jake's fantasy and couldn't tell him no without losing him. She said that Jacob punched Grace in the face and raped her as Sara watched. Grace looked at her during the attack, and Sara said to her, "I can't help you anymore. This is now your life." Sara said she and Jacob drugged Grace, bound her with zip ties, put a ball gag in her mouth, then left her in the attic closet to die in the summer heat. Before Jacob and Sara returned the following day, Grace broke free of the zip ties and spit out the ball gag. But she was unable to leave the vacant house before Jacob and Sara returned some 12 hours later. It was then Jacob grabbed Grace from behind, put her in a chokehold, and suffocated her, telling her, "Just go, honey, just go." Sara said Grace looked at her in the moments before she died, and Sara took Grace's hand and told her it was okay to go, adding that it seemed like it took forever, but in reality, it was only a couple of minutes. Sara said it was her idea to buy the cat litter to store Grace's body in, but instead, they kept the remains in the attic in a cardboard box until authorities arrived at the home in October of 2016 to follow up on the report that Grace had gone missing. It was then Sara went out and purchased a bow saw for a dual purpose, cutting firewood and dismembering Grace's body. She and Jacob cut up Grace's remains in an upstairs bathroom, then drove 75 miles to Luzerne County and dumped them in the woods, where hunters found them on Halloween. Even after Grace's body was discovered, Sara Packer said she was fairly confident that they'd get away with the crime, but she had to keep reassuring Jacob Sullivan, telling him, "Everything will be okay." The couple agreed not to search on the internet for anything related to the killing, and she hid the news stories from Jacob to not upset him. As the police investigation ramped up and media attention intensified, the couple attempted suicide, but survived. After Jacob confessed to the hospital staff and investigators, Sara felt betrayed. Also testifying was Amy Adam, Grace's guidance counselor, who testified that Grace got excellent grades but required emotional support. She said that a few months before Grace's death, Sara Packer had threatened to send her to foster care or a residential center. That prompted Grace to write a goodbye letter to her family, and the letter was displayed for the jury. The letter said, "I know that you guys are at your breaking point, and I understand. I love you guys. I always have, and I always will." Although Jacob Sullivan pleaded guilty to raping and murdering Grace, prosecutors still needed to prove Jacob committed the felonies that qualified him for the death penalty. Jacob's attorneys argued that he should get a life sentence instead, and stated and asserted that Sara Packer talked him into raping Grace. The jury, deciding whether Jacob Sullivan would live or die for the rape and murder of Grace, heard from a psychologist who testified that Jacob Sullivan was manipulated and dominated by Sara Packer. Jacob wanted to please Sara so much that it brought out the worst in him. The psychologist told the jury that Jacob Sullivan, having an intelligence of superior range, was sexually abused as a child and became interested in deviant sex from a young age. Jacob grew up in a San Francisco household where strange and erotic sex was the norm, and traditional boundaries in regards to sexual relations did not apply. After moving to Pennsylvania as a teen with his mother and stepfather, Jacob was forced to become a Jehovah's Witness. Jacob wanted to have sex with multiple partners at once, and his marriage broke up because his wife wasn't interested in that. He found a kindred spirit in Sara Packer, who he met in 2013. He liked her because she was knowledgeable and took control of the relationship. Receipts, store security video, and a monitoring device installed on Jacob's car by his insurance carrier showed that the couple bought drugs and zip ties hours before the July 7th, 2016 murder of Grace. The data from the device showed that Jacob's car stopped at an adult bookstore on Route 309 in Coopersburg for 5 minutes on July 7th, 2016, the day of Grace's rape and murder. Prosecutors showed the jury the ball gag, which they said was purchased from the store. The monitoring device also showed Jacob's car stopping at the Quakertown Walmart and the Target in Richland Township on the day of the rape and murder. Bank records show that Jacob and Sara purchased items at the stores, including over-the-counter sleep medication and scissors. Jacob bought zip ties, a fan, rubber gloves, bleach, cat litter, and a black light to detect bodily fluids when they dismembered and discarded Grace's body. One video shown in court from a Walmart in Schuylkill County near Tamaqua showed Sara Packer walking out of the store with a bottle of liquid drain cleaner. Prosecutors say Sara and Jacob poured drain cleaner on Grace's face to hide her features, having the chemical stripping the color from Grace's hair. One of the state troopers testified that when she first saw the remains of Grace in the brush, she initially thought it was that of an elderly woman because the hair on the head appeared gray. Jurors were shown photos and videos of the Richland Township rental home where Grace was raped and murdered. Evidence markers were placed next to a clump of hair and a broken piece of zip tie, just a few grisly reminders of the horror Grace endured that day. Date: March 28th, 2019. Location: Bucks County Justice Center, Doylestown, Pennsylvania. 3 days and 12 hours were all it took for the jury of 12 people to choose capital punishment for Jacob Sullivan for the murder and rape of Grace Packer. As part of his plea, Jacob admitted that he and Sara Packer plotted Grace's rape and murder for months and carried it out on July 7, 2016, in the home that they had rented. After reaching their verdict of a death sentence for Jacob Sullivan, the jurors were free to leave and return to their lives, hopefully putting the horrific story of 14-year-old Grace Packer's rape and murder behind them. Instead, all 12 jurors walked down to the hall to the more extensive courtroom open for Jacob Sullivan's sentencing to bear witness as the judge sent him to death row. In addition to the death sentence, the judge imposed an additional and consecutive life sentence, plus 44 to 88 years in prison. Jacob did not react as the death verdict was read, or when deputy sheriffs surrounded him and handcuffed him seconds later. He declined to make a statement and did not look at Grace's grandparents and other relatives who sat in the courtroom's front row. The judge called Jacob a monster and made fun of him for asking detectives early on to ensure he was placed in protective custody in prison. Calling him soulless, the judge added that Jacob was also guilty of ignoring how Sara Packer treated Grace. Matt Weintraub said Jacob Sullivan earned the harsh sentence by adding, "You could not write a horror movie with a worse script than what was done to Grace Packer." And on March 30th, 2019, more than 2 years after the horrific rape and murder of her adopted daughter Grace, and one day after her boyfriend Jacob Sullivan was sentenced to death, Sara appeared in a suburban Philadelphia courthouse and pled guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and 16 other offenses in the murder of Grace. Sara Packer was sentenced to life behind bars, the judge adding 52 to 104 years to her sentence, ensuring that she would never leave prison. The judge said, "Evil attracts evil. Evil recognizes evil. Grace will stay with me for the rest of my life." And looking directly into Sara Packer's eyes, she said, "You enjoy the state penitentiary for the rest of your life." During the proceedings, Sara seemed so disinterested that Matt Weintraub asked the judge to force her to look at him while he read an impact victim statement, calling Sara an utter, miserable failure as a parent and human being. Matt Weintraub wanted her to listen and know Grace for the first time as people who truly loved her knew Grace. Sara Packer did not make a statement. The victim impact letter was read by Grace's 14-year-old brother, Josh. And it said, "My name is Josh, and my sister is Grace. I am here today because for the very first time, it is my turn to talk about what I want to talk about. Before this tragedy, Grace and I had a tough life. We moved all the time, and we were never able to have what most people call normal. All along, everybody has told me what was best for me, but I have yet to ask for what I thought was best. So today is my turn. When I lost my sister Grace, I was heartbroken, and I will never be able to have as happy of a life or as normal a life as I would if Grace had been here. However, something that makes me feel better about Grace not being here is that today, Grace can become a hero. I would like all of you in this room to stop reading, turn off your telephone, stop playing with your pencil, and listen to why I'm saying this. I want Grace to be the person you always remember the second you leave here today. I want all of you to find a way to make sure that you watch out for the kids so that Grace's loss never happens again, because you guys are trying to make sure that you do your best to help kids when they cannot be helped by themselves. If all of you do this, it means that Grace's loss has value. If you do not help me make Grace the hero, I do not know how I can live with the loss for no reason. I know that Grace would do anything to make sure she should help other kids. If she was told that she would save lives by the loss of her life, she would say, "Do what I have to do." Please, this will help me to heal. I've lost everything that all of you take for normal. The best my life can ever be again is closer to normal, but I can never have normal because of what happened. If you all care about the impact of my loss, you will help make sure that Grace becomes the hero that I know she already is. Epilogue. In February of 2023, new legislation in honor of Grace Packer aimed to provide additional protections for Pennsylvania children in the foster system. Legislation similar to the proposed package was introduced in 2021, but has yet to become law. State lawmakers say that administrative failures and poor record keeping put Grace at risk and could put other children at risk. The new law would require establishing a statewide child abuse database to be brought online by the end of 2023. Another would extend the time records retained to 30 years and remove the provision allowing minors who abuse others to have their records expunged by age 23. In May 2020, Jacob Sullivan died at the age of 47 while incarcerated. His official cause of death was from cardiac-related health issues, specifically a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Sara Packer is currently serving her life sentence at the Women's State Prison in Muncie, Pennsylvania. This concludes this week's episode of Departed in Pennsyltucky. I'm your host, Andrea Dudek. Thanks so much for listening, and tune in next week for more true crime talk without the Valley Girl squawk.